30th March 1945, a dirt road in a pine forest east of Paderborn, Germany, 11 days before the war in Europe ends. The evening light is failing through the trees in the specific way that light fails in a northern European forest in late March, not gradually but in stages, one level of visibility at a time, until the shapes between the trees become ambiguous and then become dangerous. A column of American vehicles from the 3rd Armored Division has taken a wrong turn in the gathering dark and driven into a column of German Tiger II tanks from the 507th Heavy Panzer Battalion, the largest and most heavily armored tanks the German military produced, moving in the opposite direction on the same narrow road, and the two columns are now stopped facing each other at a range at which the Tiger II's 88mm gun can destroy anything the Americans have brought to this forest. The American division commander is in a jeep at the front of his column, which is where he always is, where he has always been, from Tunisia to Sicily to Normandy to this road, because he commanded from the front the way other men commanded from headquarters, and he regarded the headquarters approach as a category of dishonesty he did not intend to practice. He is 45 years old. He is the highest-ranking American officer killed in action on the European continent during the entire war. He is the highest-ranking Jewish officer in the United States Army. His dog tags do not say he is Jewish. His army records say he is Protestant. He shouted a Hebrew prayer before charging out of a World War I trench in France 27 years ago, in a letter he wrote to his parents afterward, which is the only written evidence that survives of what he privately considered himself to be. The question of what the man in the jeep at the front of that column actually was, by faith, by identity, by the measure of what a man carries inside the official record of himself, is a question that this road and this forest is about to make permanently unanswerable, and which the record he left behind has been answering ever since. Major General Maurice Rose was 45 years old. He was born on November 26, 1899, in Middletown, Connecticut, the son of Rabbi Samuel Rose, who served a Denver, Colorado congregation for more than 40 years, and the grandson of a rabbi who had led one of Poland's premier centers of Jewish learning before immigrating to America. The family moved to Denver when Maurice was 4 years old, and he grew up in the specific texture of a rabbi's household in a Western American city at the turn of the 20th century. The synagogue at the center of the week's rhythm, the Hebrew prayers memorized before the English language was fully mastered, the particular combination of dignity and vigilance that characterized Jewish communal life in a city that was friendly enough by comparison with Europe, but which was not without its own ambient expressions of a prejudice that wore different clothes in different latitudes but carried the same interior logic. Maurice Rose was a boy who wanted to be a soldier from an age young enough that his classmates at East High School in Denver drew a cartoon of him in the school newspaper carrying a rifle, which means the ambition was public and specific and not a surprise to anyone who knew him. He lied about his age to enlist in the Colorado National Guard at 16, was discharged when his actual age was discovered, re-enlisted at 17, went to France with the American Expeditionary Force in 1917, was wounded at the Battle of St. Mihiel, and wrote home to his parents about it in a letter that contained the sentence that historians would spend decades locating and assessing, the sentence describing the moment before he led a charge out of the trenches when he shouted Shema Yisrael into the French morning air. Hear, O Israel, the central declaration of Jewish faith, the prayer recited at the threshold of death, spoken by the rabbi's son from Denver in the moment before he ran toward the German line. He wrote about it to his parents because it was the kind of thing you told your parents. He did not write about it to anyone else. When he rejoined the regular army after World War I and began the long, systematic climb through the ranks that would take him from second lieutenant to major general across 25 years of service, he listed his religion on his army records as Protestant. He listed it that way for the rest of his career. His dog tags, the metal identification worn against a soldier's chest, did not carry the letter J that indicated Jewish religious affiliation. His hospital intake records listed, over the years, approximately 6 different Christian denominations, which historians who examined those records later noted was not the behavior of a man with a religious practice, but of a man with a strategy, because nobody accumulates 6 denominations before 45 through sincere conversion, and the letter J on a dog tag in the United States Army Army of the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s was a designation that carried costs he had apparently decided he was not willing to pay. There is no document, no letter, no recorded conversation in which Maurice Rose explained this decision. There is only the decision itself, visible in the negative space of the records he kept, and the career that the decision permitted, and the question of whether a man who concealed his identity to achieve the power to fight the ideology targeting that identity was calculating or compromised or simply doing the only thing available to him in a world that had made the cost of visibility too high to sustain, and the cost of concealment something he apparently decided he could live with. The United States Army of the interwar years and the early war years was not a neutral institution on the question of Jewish advancement. The senior officer corps of the period had absorbed from the surrounding culture the specific form that American antisemitism took in those decades. Not the crude violence of European fascism, but the genteel exclusion of social hierarchy. The understanding communicated not through explicit policy, but through the quiet machinery of promotion boards and club memberships and assignment decisions that collectively created ceilings that were not written in any regulation, but were visible in the career trajectories of the men who encountered them. Several American Jewish officers who served in the Second World War have left accounts, in memoirs and oral histories, of the specific experience of navigating an institution that officially did not discriminate, and practically did so through mechanisms sophisticated enough to be individually deniable and collectively unmistakable. Rose left no such account. What he left was a record of advancement so continuous and so grounded in documented operational performance that the machinery of informal exclusion had no clean point at which to stop him, because the performance was always there, always measured, always exceeding whatever threshold the board in front of him was applying. He had, in the specific sense available to a man operating inside an institution whose informal rules required him to be better than his non-Jewish peers to achieve equivalent recognition, consistently been better. Not marginally better, substantially, measurably, undeniably better. His superiors described him in terms that the official language of military assessment reserved for officers of unusual quality. Patton, who held views on Jewish people that were recorded in his private diaries with the casual brutality of a man who did not bother to conceal his prejudices from himself, worked with Rose across multiple campaigns and assessed him as among the finest combat commanders he had encountered. Whether Patton knew with certainty that Rose was Jewish is unclear from the surviving record. Whether it would have changed his assessment of Rose's operational performance is a question the record does not answer. What the record does show is that by the summer of 1944, when the breakout from Normandy required the kind of aggressive armored leadership that the war in Europe had not yet fully demonstrated was available in the American order of battle, Maurice Rose was the man selected to demonstrate it. The 3rd Armored Division under Rose's command became, in the 8 months between his assumption of divisional command in France in August 1944 and his death on the road outside Paderborn in March 1945, the instrument through which a series of firsts were accomplished that the military history of the European theater recorded with the specificity reserved for genuinely unprecedented achievements. On September 12, 1944, Rose's division became the first Allied armored unit to enter Germany, crossing the border in a moment that carried a weight the operational records measured in coordinates and a weight the personal records of the men present measured in something they were not required to articulate in any official form. The first Allied tanks into Nazi Germany were commanded by a man whose army records said he was Protestant and whose grandfather had led a center of Jewish learning in Poland and whose father was a rabbi in Denver who would, in 4 days after the death on the road outside Paderborn, write a poem about his son for publication in the Denver newspaper that began with the line, "So I make known to the world at large that man can reach heights." The first tanks into Germany were commanded by a man who had shouted Shema Yisrael before a charge in 1917 and had spent the subsequent 27 years not shouting it again in any recorded form, and who led those tanks not as a Jewish general because the Army's official records did not contain that designation for him, but who led them as whatever he privately was on the inside of a record that the outside of the record did not accurately describe. On March 29, 1945, the day before his death, Rose's division made the longest single-day advance through enemy territory of any Allied division during the entire war, covering more than 100 miles in a single day of movement that the operational maps recorded in the clean language of coordinates, and that the men who executed it experienced in the specific texture of an army that had been told it was almost over and had decided to move at the speed that belief permitted. 100 miles in one day. The following morning he took his position at the front of his column, as he always did, and drove toward Paderborn. The column had been moving through the forest east of Paderborn in the late afternoon and early evening of March 30th when it encountered the German Tiger II tanks on the road. The details of what happened in the next several minutes were reconstructed afterward from the accounts of the survivors who were present, and the reconstructions produced a sequence of events that was clear enough in its outline and ambiguous enough in its decisive moment to generate a war crimes investigation, the only individual casualty in the entire European theater to generate one. The jeep carrying Rose and his aide and his driver attempted to turn around on the narrow forest road and found that every direction available to it was occupied by German armor. Rose's aide, Major Robert Bellinger, survived and gave an account describing what followed. German tank personnel were present and armed and directing the Americans to surrender their weapons. Rose reached for his pistol holster. Whether he was reaching to surrender the pistol or to draw it is the question that the investigation could not resolve, and that the men who were there could not resolve with the certainty the investigation required, because the German tank commander fired before the reach was completed, and the ambiguity of the gesture died with the man making it. Rose was killed instantly. The investigation could not identify the specific German tanker responsible. The case was closed without a finding of deliberate war crime. Whether Rose was killed because of an honest misreading of a gesture in poor light, or whether something else was operating in the moment, whether the Jewish general's identity was known, whether it could have been known, whether it mattered in the fraction of a second available to a German tank commander making a decision, is a question that no surviving document or testimony answers, and that the record leaves permanently open. The question of who Maurice Rose was did not end with his death. It continued with a specific intensity in the decisions made about what should mark the ground where he was buried. Rose's army records listed him as Protestant. The military processed this designation in the standard manner and marked his temporary grave with a cross, which was the standard marker for Protestant soldiers. The Denver Jewish community, which had known Samuel Rose and which understood what the son of a rabbi was regardless of what his army record said, objected. The marker was changed to a Star of David. A rabbi who had served with the army in Europe objected to the change, citing the army records. The argument about what symbol should stand over Maurice Rose's grave was an argument about the same question the man himself had spent a career not answering on the record, and which the people left behind were now required to answer with a permanent marker in a cemetery in the Netherlands. The permanent grave at the Netherlands American Cemetery at Margraten bears a cross, reflecting the listed religious preference of an army record that the man who made it left deliberately ambiguous for reasons he never wrote down. His father's poem appeared in the Denver newspaper. 10,000 soldiers who served under Rose in the 3rd Armored Division donated $30,000 to the Jewish community's campaign to name a new Denver hospital after him. The hospital was named the General Maurice Rose Memorial Hospital. A rabbi's son who listed himself as Protestant in his army records had a Jewish community hospital named after him by 10,000 of his own soldiers who donated from their own pockets to make the naming possible, which is a fact that does not resolve the question of his identity, but which describes the shape of what people who knew him understood about it. Samuel Rose, the rabbi of Denver who had raised the boy who became the general, lived until 1961. He buried his son, who had died as the highest-ranking American officer killed in action in Europe and the highest-ranking Jewish officer in the United States Army, and he wrote his poem, and he continued his rabbinate in Denver for 16 more years after the war ended. He never publicly criticized the cross on his son's grave at Margraten. He did not have to. He had already said, in the poem he wrote for the newspaper, that man can reach heights and accept the charge to duty divine, which was a rabbi's way of saying that the heights his son had reached were understood in the household where Maurice Rose had learned to shout Shema Yisrael before a charge for exactly what they were. Some historians who have examined Rose's career and his concealment of his religious identity have argued that the concealment was a straightforward survival strategy inside an institution with documented anti-Semitic promotion practices, and that reading it as anything more complicated than that is to impose on a practical career decision a moral weight it was not designed to carry. They note that Rose's operational performance was sufficiently exceptional that it would likely have produced similar results regardless of his listed religion, and that therefore the concealment may have been unnecessary, which is itself a judgment available only in retrospect and from outside the institution Rose was navigating from within. Others have argued that the concealment is the most significant single fact about Rose's career because it means that the highest-ranking Jewish officer in the American Army, the officer who led the first Allied armor into Germany, who made the longest single-day advance of any Allied division, who drove his tanks to within days of Berlin, accomplished all of this while carrying the specific weight of a hidden identity inside an institution whose informal culture would have used that identity against him if he had declared it, and that this makes his career not simply a military achievement, but a specific kind of testimony about the cost of survival inside institutions that are officially neutral and practically otherwise. What is certain is that Maurice Rose drove his tanks from the beaches of Normandy to a forest road outside Paderborn, across 8 months of the most effective armored leadership the American Army produced in the European theater, and that he did it as the son and grandson of rabbis whose dog tags did not say so, and that the man who killed him in the forest dark on March 30th, 1945, did not know he was a general and did not know he was Jewish, which means that none of what he had spent his career managing against mattered in the 4 seconds available to the German tanker making his decision, and that the grave over which the argument about identity was conducted is in the Netherlands, 7 days' drive from the Polish city where his grandfather's Jewish Learning Center once stood, in a country his tanks helped liberate in September 1944, which he entered first, as he always did, from the front. If you had been Maurice Rose, the rabbi's son who wrote Shema Yisrael into a letter home and then spent 27 years not writing it into any official document, would you have made the same choice with the records? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you believe the men who carried the weight of hidden identity into the fight against the ideology that made the hiding necessary deserve to be known by the full measure of what they were carrying, subscribe, because the record still has entries in it that the official documents never accurately describe.